So it's good to know that they are not a political machine. They might have political initiatives, but that doesn't mean they're a political party or a political machine. So what does that mean? Well, they're like lobbyists. They want stuff. And because they represent farmers, they want two major goals. They want to regulate railroad rates, and they want the only way, and the textbook is very confusing when it comes to this. All right, so let's say you're a farmer and you have your grain, and you take your grain and you move it up to the train station. Where do you put it? I mean, you can't just, the train's not there yet, so you have to store it somewhere. You can wait, and the train could take, a day to get there, 14 hours, 12 hours. So what most farmers did is they stored it someplace. In the textbook, they talk about that having a storage fee. So what the Grangers wanted is they wanted to regulate storage fees. To regulate storage fees. And I just gave you like 3 answers to the test. All Granger questions. There's a couple more down the road, but political, it's not a political party. They're not a political machine. They're like a lobbyist group. They're trying to regulate, they're supporting farmers, trying to regulate railroad rates, and they're trying to get regulated storage fees. Kind of talked a little bit about the some elections. We've had a bunch of elections. One election we want to talk about is the election with the Populist Party. Okay, now the Populist Party is a party, a political party that supports farmers. All right, so the Populist Party is one that supports farmers. Okay, Populist Party supports farmers. In the 1892 election, I think one of the reasons why I think this is a challenging test is because there is a bunch of different elections. So all these elections seem to be really hard to remember. And somehow over the last couple weeks, we've hit all the presidents. And hopefully you have those in your notes. I probably won't spend a whole lot of time going over the answers, but what I'll do is I'll go over some questions. So you're just gonna hopefully have to figure it out. Doesn't mean that these are all presidents only, right? There's an assassination here, right? So one president gets elected twice. So there's a couple other things dealing with that. But in the 92 election, we're talking about this one because this was an election that they included a Populist Party member. So a candidate, Populist Party candidate. So in 1892, there's a Populist Party candidate. We already talked about Populist Party was a farmers group. The second thing is that they weren't very successful because they kind of attached themselves to a radical group of white Southerners. So they kind of attached themselves to white Southerners. And they were more racial, and they believed in more racial separation, which, you know, if you're attaching yourself to that group, they thought it would help them, kind of hurt them. So white Southern farmers and the racial ones, the radical racial segregationists who wanted to separate from, you know, blacks and all the other groups. So the reason why the Populist Party was not successful is that that's what they kind of connected themselves to. So a lot of this is all Kennedy book. This is all, about 90% of what we're doing, 85% or so, is all in the textbook, Kennedy book, and again, 4 chapters is a lot. A couple more things with Populist Party. There's no doubt that the Populist Party savored a shorter workday. Shorter workday, that was kind of key. Populist Party, shorter workday. They also called the People's Party because the People's Party had a lot of interest. There's a lot of farmers still in America, still around 50% or more. And can someone help her with that? I don't know. And since the Populist Party were representing farmers and still in America, before 1900 there was more farmers in America than any other profession, so that was why they called it the People's Party. It supported a shorter workday overall. All right. Right after this election in 1892, we see a panic. The panic, normal panics lead into depressions. In American history, we usually see panic whether you're selling off stocks, where your people start to, you know, hold off and not spend. The key about panics is when you stop buying things, everything gets stagnant, and so that's a problem with the economy. Most panics lead to depression. Same thing this one. After this election in 1892, leads to a panic. Remember that was Cleveland was the president. Not to skip around, but gonna skip around. 1876, not intentionally skipping around, but a few things with the election of 1876 is controversial election because it's the election that is has a few states that are controversial. I think we took down some of those states. So good to know that the states had disputed count in the count of ballots. So similar to that in the election of 2000, there was a few states that had a controversial counting system. Same thing in the election of 76. In 1876, it was also, it concluded with the Compromise of 1877. And that led to the end of military reconstruction. The election, 76 was the Hayes-Tilden election. Hayes and Tilden, good to know, both the Republican candidates, Hayes, and the Democratic candidate, Samuel Tilden. Okay, we'll probably hit some other elections down the road, but I'm just going to go over some random topics, and it's good to note. Some of the stuff I'll just kind of tell you a little bit more about it. Some will just be, I'll just say the topic, and hopefully you know a little bit about it. There's no possible way in the short time that we have that I can go over everything as far as question, answer. It is four chapters. And I would argue that this was probably one of the, a pretty hard exam because there's a lot of different topics. So I'm going to go over a lot of topics. Not to say that I can give all the answers and give all those things, but there's a lot of stuff talking about. So real quick, I'm just going to go through everything as much as I can. All right. So one topic is about the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. So make sure you know a little bit about the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. And this is, again, back to farmers. So farmers wanted to get this passed. Number one, with Sherman, he wanted silver to be in circulation, so put more money in circulation. That's one. Two, take gold off the standard by itself. So it's not just gold. It's both silver and gold. And the third thing is it allows there to be a create cheap money. So right now, gold is pretty expensive. When you get silver, it's less expensive. So you can get more of it. So basically, in essence, the topic comes up. It's called cheap money. So you can create cheap money. So that's what farmers wanted. Farmers wanted Sherman to pass the Silver Purchase Act, the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. Right. Wilson-Gorman tariff. The Wilson-Gorman tariff. Now, we don't see an income tax in American history in the 1800s, except this says this tariff includes an income tax, which in all of the 1900s, the 19th century, and even before, we've never seen an income tax. Hamilton wanted one, but we don't see one. And we don't even see one until the 16th Amendment comes around. 17th. So down the road, after the turn of the century, we see one. But the Wilson-Gorman tariff, the most interesting part of this tariff was that it had included an income tax. Right. Cross of Gold speech. So when we talk about money, one of the things that, and then I guess we can go back to an election, but in 1896, there was a guy named William Jennings Bryan who's running for president. He is going to have this concept of bimetallism. You're going to have both gold and silver standard, which we've kind of talked about already. So William Jennings Bryan, in his Cross of Gold speech, which is a great speech that talks about not just relying on gold only, he gave it, and he becomes the populist and Democratic Party that merged together. That's their candidate. So there's a really good chance in 1896 that the Democrats are going to win this election. They don't, but because the Democrats are going to connect themselves with the populists. And part of their platform is bimetallism. Part of their platform leads to the Cross of Gold speech. And it's William Jennings Bryan, and he is a Democrat. Plus, he also gets endorsed by the populists. All those things that I just said is probably like 3 questions. Huh? Okay, a few questions ago, so try not to answer questions too long ago, because it's going to take a little backseat to what I'm talking about. So you said, what? I didn't hear the last part of your question.
You said that it takes gold off standard.
Huh?
What is that?
Off the focus. when you have a gold standard, gold's the only thing that is the monetary supply. So it's the only thing. When you take it off the standard, now you have two things that are working together to support the money in America. So it's off the main thing. All right. Going to continue on with Black Friday. So Black Friday, there's a bunch of people that were involved in Black Friday because, again, this was right after the Civil War and one of the very first early economic depressions we had after the Civil War. And at that time, there was two guys that were kind of dealing with trying to corner the gold market. Before break, we were watching a little bit about Vanderbilt and Carnegie and Rockefeller. And Vanderbilt kind of got screwed because he had these two guys, Fisk and Gould, who were trying to corner the gold market. And what he did, we watched in the video, was we saw that they were selling off a bunch of shares. They were making shares up, and they were making them off, and he was buying them off. Pretty deviant guys. Same two guys are trying to corner the gold market. In the textbook, it's called Black Friday. In the textbook, it also is referring to both guys, Fisk and Gould. Fisk is F-I-S-K, and Gould, J. Gould, G-U-L-D. Fisk and Gould are the two guys involved in the scandal. It's called Black Friday. And also, not that he was involved, but Grant was kind of indirectly associated. Not that he knew anything about it, but because he was the president, because he had put these guys in this position, all those three people were directly or indirectly with the Black Friday scandal, which basically represents going into the economic depression in the 70s. Railroads. Again, not going in any particular order. When we talk about railroads, one of the main developments of the railroads, obviously, is the Bessemer process. We've talked about that a bunch of times. We've seen the video. There's a couple questions from the video. I've already talked about that in the past. But Carnegie in the video, we talked about how Carnegie went to England and brought back the idea, the concept of Nast producing. He didn't invent the Bessemer process. It was actually Bessemer. He didn't, again, transferring iron into steel. And Carnegie and the Bessemer process made Carnegie really, really successful in Pennsylvania. Carnegie, and there's another guy named William Kelly. William Kelly also, along with Carnegie, brought the idea to America. Carnegie gets credit for the money part of it. Kelly gets the idea of bringing it to America. Bessemer is the inventor. Good to know all three of those people. And the concept is blasts molten and iron with air. That's the concept. And it basically, what Carnegie did was be able to have an inexpensive process to develop steel. Second part of that is obviously, without Bessemer, you don't have the railroads. You don't have the development of the railroads that then moves people into the cities. Okay, the ICC, there's a question about the first, we had this on our quiz, the first federal regulatory agency that's going to protect the public from business. So the first federal regulatory agency is called the ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission, and they're going to protect the people from business. How do they do that? Well, the ICC is responsible as a commission to regulate railroad rates, to make sure that the people don't get screwed because companies are going to charge really high rates. So they're going to protect the public from business. Keeping on the business topic, we talked about vertical and horizontal. Remember, vertical is the one that goes every aspect. Horizontal is one aspect. So whether it was, Rockefeller tried to do multiple areas, because in the video, if you remember, there was parts where he was trying to get oil, petroleum, 2 spots. And then, so he was trying to do the transportation part, he was trying to do the refinery, he was trying to do everything. It didn't work for him. But Carnegie was able to do every aspect. And Morgan in some areas as well. So vertical is every aspect of an industry you monopolize, every single aspect. And that's the vertical. Horizontal is one aspect. Sometimes buying out your competition. When you do horizontal or vertical, this is another question on the test, you have to somehow wipe out competition. If you don't wipe out competition, the other way to do it is you build a trust. If you build a trust with the other companies, you put them together, then you all screw out all the customers, right? So everybody agrees to raise prices really high. So 2 ways to do a monopoly or horizontal or vertical. You either wipe out competition, you lower prices so far that you wipe out your competition and then you jack prices up, or you agree with your other competitors to just regulate rates and raise them really high so that you can make a profit. Okay, so that's vertical and horizontal. Obviously, going to ask a question about matching the people like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan with their industry. So hopefully you know that. Still with this ICC and stuff, we talk about the Wabash case. There's not many Supreme Court cases during this time in American history. Well, there is, but we don't usually get a whole lot out in our American textbook. But the Wabash case is important. And basically it talks about the Supreme Court reiterated that states didn't have the right to regulate the ICC. So the federal government will, but the states could not. And because if there's a federal law that's passed, then the states can't change that federal law. And this gets back to something that we'll keep talking about, it's states' rights. States believe that they have the same amount of rights, the same ability as the federal law. It's not true. The federal law is above it and states are below it. So Wabash case said it didn't have the right to reiterate the ICC or interstate commerce. All right, let's hit some labor stuff. Continuing on with strikes. So there is definitely a strike, the Pullman strike. Good to know. Basically, a couple things to know about the Pullman strike besides that it was, it was not the only railroad car strike, but it was a railroad car strike. It was settled by a federal injunction. And like all of these, pretty violent. The Haymarket Square riot, Haymarket Square bombing. Talked about one of the very first strikes. The first major strike is the railroad, the Great Railroad or Great Railway Strike of 1870 or 77. And this is when the railroad was getting stopped, and because the railroad was getting stopped and it had federal mail on it, it ended up being a federal issue. And the only reason it was federal issue is because of the material on the train. It has nothing to do with between the states, because each state was dealing with it differently. But because it was stopping mail, and when the mail is stopped, it's a federal issue. So one more time, the Great Railroad Strike was a federal issue because the mail was being stopped. So in that particular strike, a couple questions from the Kennedy book. One is, it's the first time that the president actually intervenes, uses federal troops. And the way it started was because you had 4 different railroad companies, and each of the 4 decided to cut salaries. So every 4 railroad owner got together, they met up, and they said, we want to cut everyone's salary. And so they threw it out there to the people, and all the workers, who then joined quickly the labor union, and we saw that as the first nationwide strike. Again, another topic on the test. 4 railroad companies decided to go salary cut, and number 2, it's the first railroad strike. Okay, another question dealing with labor unions. So most labor unions, the ones that are going to favor immigration, they favored immigration restriction, so they favored some sort of quota or immigration restriction, because labor unions didn't like immigrants because they were used as strikebreakers. So good to know that labor unions felt threatened, because once there's a strike, owners would just go to immigrants and they would use them as strikebreakers. Remember, the same thing, a strikebreaker is also a scab, right? Don't get caught up with this trick question about scabs. Scabs are not just immigrants. They are immigrants, but they're not solely immigrants. Good to know. Scab is a replacement worker, right? Also, immigrants were hard to unionize. It would be hard to unionize them. They didn't care too much. Immigrants just wanted work. They wanted to just get a job. So they were difficult to unionize. Plus, they were cheaper. They would be willing to work for less. So agreements that employees signed when joining a company, when they agreed not to be a part of a union. So if you walked into my business and I said, hey, will you sign this paper? You're basically going to sign this thing called a yellow dog contract. So yellow dog contract was agreeing not to unionize. Tricky question on the test. So one more time, yellow dog contract, you would agree not to unionize. Okay. Remember, when you agree not to unionize, that probably has something to do with strikes too, right? So if you're not going to unionize, then you couldn't strike. So be careful when you're reading these questions. It's the same thing. When you join a union, you join a group, the group then strikes, then you agree to strike. Okay, so Knights of Labor, a couple questions about the Knights of Labor. Later on, we're going to see them in the late 1800s allowing blacks and women involved as members. So they're going to change over time. The very first labor union is called the National Labor Union. That's the very first one. And then as you go through American history, you have a lot of different ones. The Knights of Labor is just another one. And again, one of the problems between having a labor union with a bunch of different groups is that you don't always agree on what you want. Once you start to specialize your group, you know if you're just going to go skilled workers, one group of just the steel workers, just one group, then it's smaller, but it's more specialized. So the difference, you can have a huge group. This is a massive labor union. It's not always very consistent with what they want. Sometimes the smaller labor unions would be the better unions because they go to exactly what they want. Probably not as big though, right? Too many difference. All right, I think that is pretty much it about labor unions. I'm just kind of checking the dump. There's nothing else. Let's get into a couple other just random topics. For example, the Homestead Act. Homestead Act is going to be on the test a few times. First of all, encourage the development of farming. That's what it encouraged. It encouraged developing farmers in the farming industry. It gave them the opportunity of having 160 acres. Wasn't free. Sometimes it cost, but it was really cheap. If it wasn't free, it was really cheap. Don't get caught up. It's not the only one that is selling Western land. It's not the only act that sells Western land. It is one, and it's one that doesn't even sell most of the land. It's not responsible for most of the land, but it is one. And one of the reasons why it was important was because it was during the Civil War, and Lincoln wanted to get out there and encourage that he was still doing stuff. It promoted frontier settlement, so it wanted them to go west. And unfortunately, there was a lot of settlers who acquired this land who were unsuccessful. So according to Kennedy, there was a majority of these settlers who were unsuccessful. What we see after the Civil War, most farmers grew single cash crops. Single cash crops. The way to make money is to massively produce one product, sell it, and then be able to make a profit on the one crop. It's a lot easier think in that section we also talk about the Dawes Severity Act. This one is going to not eventually do what it said it was meaning to do, but what it tried to do was provide Native American families with land and opportunity. It doesn't do that. Provided land, and the law, and according to Kennedy, the law of it said basically head of household. So if you were a head of household of a Native American family, then you basically would get the land. Most Native Americans didn't want the land. That wasn't the point. So it was not successful. See a bunch of names. Helen Hunt Jackson, good to know. Talk about her book about the Indian and white relations over a century. I remember that book was called The Century of Dishonor. A few other things in this chapter about the West. We know that there's a few battles that are in here. The Battle of Wounded Knee. Good to know a little bit about each of these things that are going to come up here in the next couple of seconds. Battle of Little Bighorn, I think we mentioned. If not, good to know a little bit about the Battle of Little Bighorn. Few Native Americans on this. I'm not going to mention them. I'm assuming that if you don't, you can kind of go through and double check to see who is where. I want to get into a different topic right now. I want to talk about the new and old immigrants. I think we talked about this before. With the new and old, we talked about the old immigrants are the ones that came before like the 1890s. And they were, most of the time they were somehow educated. If they didn't have full schooling, they had internships or apprenticeships or some sort of skill when they came to America. So either education or skill. And then they didn't really care about their identity. They kind of left their identity back home. What we see is that we see a lot of these old immigrants coming from the northeastern part of Europe, like Ireland and England and other places, northeast Europe. Sorry, I said northeast, I meant northwest. England, northwest, sorry. So the northwestern Europeans we see having a little bit of money, having a little bit of knowledge, having a little bit of skill, didn't care about their identity, didn't care about going back home. While we talk about new and old, there's always that thing called birds of passage. And a birds of passage is someone who comes to America, works for a little bit, and goes. For all of the 17 and 1800s that we've been talking about in the past few months, there's always birds of passage, all in American history. But most of the old immigrants, ironically, are not birds of passage. They're going to stay. Good to know what a birds of passage is, right? Birds of passage. So then we talk about the new immigrants. Well, the new immigrants don't have a lot of money, if any, don't have education, don't have much of a skill. Southeastern Europe, so the countries that don't have a whole lot of money, we see them coming with no money, and They do want to keep their identity, though. They want to come and they kind of want to stay in the communities. So we see from here, we see little towns pop open, like little Chinatowns, little German towns, little communities that pop to, that still exist today. So question on the test is, which group opened up small communities that still exist today? It's the new immigrants. And from that, we talk about social houses and social reforms and whole house. So from the new immigrants, we have this new group of reformer. And the reformer that we talk about is people like Jane Addams, Florence Kelly, two names, Addams and Kelly, that are going to be social workers. Addams and Kelly. And they both are critically important for immigrants. They come into the social or the settlement houses. Those, both of them are reformers, and they develop settlement houses. And the settlement houses that they promoted had these new immigrants learning the language, listening to their old music, doing anything and everything to kind of help them adjust. And sometimes it's just doing stuff that they used to have in the past, back in their old country. Eating foods that are back from that country, sometimes feeding them. So the social programs started with people like Jane Addams and Florence Kelly. They're pioneers, right? Pioneers of the social movement. Jane Addams is famous for her Hull House, Hull, and that was in Chicago. All right, so a little bit about some other social stuff. Boss Tweed. His name was William Tweed. They called him Boss. He was a leader of Tammany Hall. Referred to as the Tweed Ring. Tweed, T-W-E-E-D, the Tweed Ring. So the Tweed Ring was a political machine, Tammany Hall, a political machine that kind of took advantage, it took advantage of immigrants. And when it took advantage of immigrants, it basically put them in dumbbell tenements, gave them jobs. It sounds amazing. But the problem is, the conditions were crappy. They paid them really bad. They didn't give them enough money to buy good quality food. So it was just taking advantage of them. In response to all of this, there was a writer by the name of, or a journalist by the name of Thomas Nast, N-A-S-T. Thomas Nast, the story says that he wrote a bunch of articles that talked about discrimination, treatment of the immigrants, and he was really in their corner. Problem is, nobody cared. Well, nobody cared because nobody could read it. What changed it all was when Thomas Nast started to draw cartoons. So when he started to draw cartoons, then immigrants who couldn't speak the language could see the cartoon. So, summary of the story. Boss Tweed was discriminating against those immigrants, taking advantage of them in his political machine called Tammany Hall. Thomas Nast exposed him, exposed the corruption through his political cartoons. You've probably heard a magazine called Harper's Weekly. So Harper's Weekly showed all these cartoons, and it showed the corruption that Thomas Nast was trying to, get on Boss Tweed this whole time. But it wasn't in the articles, it was in the cartoons. Question on Jim Crow laws. I think we briefly talked a little bit about Jim Crow laws and establishing a system of segregation. I want to double check, but I'm pretty sure there was a Plessy versus Ferguson question in this chapter, right? Anybody remember Plessy versus Ferguson? So Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court case. And it's a huge, important case because in 1898, when they passed this Supreme Court decision, 1896. 1896 was the year of Plessy. Plessy was unbelievable, especially, Martin Luther King Day yesterday, all the things that he did to battle segregation and discrimination. What Plessy did was Plessy was basically legalizing segregation. It was legalizing segregation. How does that work? Well, when you legalize segregation, you basically say that all you need is two. You just need two things. Did I do this before? Have I talked about Plessy versus Ferguson? So, for example, if you have two things, then you're legal. It doesn't matter. There are two bathrooms. One bathroom has, it's beautiful. It's got a toilet, it's got pictures, it's got a window, it's got light, it's got air, it's got beautiful, clean, it's amazing. The other one's got a hole in the ground. There's two bathrooms. That legally is allowing the rest of the country for the next 60 years to segregate. Why? Because let's say there's only one. According to Plessy versus Ferguson, that's illegal. You can't have one. You need two. This, let's call it for whites only. Whites get the best one. Everybody else gets a hole. No paper, no place to sit. You have to squat and hopefully hit the hole. So it's really bad. But that is what it talked about. Plessy versus Ferguson said, and the quote is, separate but equal facilities are constitutional. Separate but equal facilities are constitutional. Now, obviously, these aren't equal at all, but that's not the point. The point is there's two of them. And for the next 60 years of American history, that's what we live by. We live by if there's two. And then finally, in 1954, there's a little girl by the name of Linda Brown who wants to go to a school. And it's right next to her house, but she can't because she has to go to a black school. Why? Because it's separate but equal. So they go all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and she wins, and this case, is overturned. And the words separate equal is unconstitutional. This says separate equal. That's what we're talking about in American history. And so for the next 60 years, we see easy to racially segregate. Why? Because it's in the Constitution. It says you can. You can make two. Now, don't forget, if you only have one, it's illegal. It doesn't matter what it is. It's illegal. And there is a great gray area when you do that. That could be for railroad cars. Absolutely. One could be a beautiful sleeping car. The other one could just have hay. Doesn't matter. As long as there's two. Plessy versus Ferguson. All right. Last few questions. We were watching the president's videos, and we watched quite a bit of them. We talked about here's a bunch of different questions that are dealing with presidents So there was a president who had an illegitimate child, and he also got married in the White House. There's a president who got a speeding ticket while he was president, as he was racing through Washington, D.C. There was a president who was elected to 2 consecutive terms of these guys, and there was a president with inconsecutive terms, right? There's only 2 guys that got elected twice. Grant and Cleveland, right? President that only served 2 years. President that did not support protective tariffs. Just if you remember, it's kind of down here at the end. The main protective tariff that we're going to find out about is the McKinley tariff. There's a protective tariff called McKinley. McKinley is actually a president here in 1896. There was a president that did not support protective tariffs. It's not McKinley. President used a veto a bunch. He used it more than all the presidents previously combined. He used it more than that. President that often left his responsibilities to go watch baseball. He was a preacher. He served in the House. And we haven't seen that in American history. We haven't seen someone just go directly from the House to the presidency all the way before. So first time we see that. It's the same guy. And then one that serves as a great reformer, and he's the one that passes the Pendleton Act. Now remember, Pendleton is civil service reform. In 1880, Garfield gets elected. He gets assassinated. And if you remember, Arthur comes into that spot. So there was that old argument with stalwarts and half-breeds. They're all Republicans, but remember they are factions in the Republican Party. And of all the presidents, a lot of them were Civil War veterans. But Arthur wasn't. And that was the one thing that was kind of the big thing with a lot of these presidents, is there were a lot of them, especially the early ones, right? Not a Civil War veteran. One of the president's wives had a passion for temperance. Didn't like alcohol in the White House. I think her name was Lucy Lemonade or something. Story about not a lot of drinking, and then when the next president comes in, they bring back the drink. Come back and have a lot more drinking in the White House. Most of these presidents are laissez-faire. One can directly be associated, probably mostly associated with laissez-faire, is Grover Cleveland. And there are also, don't forget, a couple questions dealing with Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Not easy tomorrow. Just to give you a heads up, challenging. Absolutely challenging.